My name's Michael Sharman, Director of Product and Engineering out of the Sydney office.
Hi folks, I'm Denis. I'm also out of the Sydney office and Director of Product and Business Intelligence. So over the next half hour or so, we're just going to take you through a couple different points across our analytics and reporting offering. We're going to start off with giving you an idea of what sort of data we collect today. After that, I'm going to spend a moment giving you an overview of the different report types that we have that are student and teacher-centric alike. Following on from that, I think Michael's going to take you through some of the customization and the extension points that we have within the reports offering. Finally, we're going to wrap up with giving you an understanding of the analysis that we already do with some of our aggregate reports. And on top of that, we'll look to the future, where else the offering's headed.
So a couple of things, a couple of the goals that we wanted to focus on with analytics. Firstly, we want to make the data that you have, that we store for you, really readily available and more valuable to you guys. So we wanted to make complex reporting easier. We want to provide analysis tools, so tools so you could get raw data, do analysis yourselves, and then we'd also do analysis for your data. So we want to handle, like with the other APIs, a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So looking into briefly, what sort of data do we collect? Well, at a simple level, all the millions of sessions and all the millions of tests and the millions of responses that students take, we put them into a very simplistic diagram here, but we put them into a big data warehouse. So what sort of data is that? At the session level, that's at the summary level. So the key there is we have no personally identifiable information. So that's a really critical thing for us. That's your context. We don't store it and we don't want it. But we do store things like the number of questions that were attempted on a test. We talk about the status, whether or not a session is still in progress or whether it's been completed, maybe it's been discarded by an administrator. We have the dates, obviously, when it was started, when it was finished, and you can leverage all those sorts of things in different reporting scenarios. Three of the key pieces of... Great question. So we're talking about session. Well, Michael, what is a session? Good question. A session for us is, think of it as an instance of a test. Student comes along, they're about to take a math unit 2 test, 20 questions in it, that's what we call a session. It might only be two questions, 100 questions, whatever it is, one instance of a test, we call that a session on our side. So in a part of that, there are 3 key pieces of information that we store with the sessions. The activity ID, the session ID, and the user ID. So I did say we don't store any personally identifiable information, so what's the user ID? The user ID is just a token. It's a unique identifier for them, probably a string of numbers, but it's not their name. So again, we don't store anything that personally identifies the student. You have all that. And the hook is, the link there is just the user ID. The session ID is the unique instance, the unique identifier for that session. So you might want to do reporting on one specific student, their one taking of that test. That's your session ID. And the activity ID we can use to group sessions. So maybe you're doing an ELA test for a specific section of your cohort. Okay, you might wrap all those sessions ID up in one activity ID. So 1,000 students take a test, one activity ID. They each have a unique session ID, so there's 1,000 session IDs there, but that one activity ID means you can report on that. It's basically a grouping mechanism. Okay, that's at the session level. At the response level, obviously we're tracking responses. We have the actual question data, the blueprint of the question that the student took. That's handy if they're resuming and maybe the content has changed, so we store that snapshot. And obviously the responses and whether or not they've attempted it, those sorts of things. At the scores level, we have session, question, and item level scores. For some of you in the audience, you might be sort of scratching your head, why is he talking about questions and items as if they're different things? Well, for us, they actually are. Another potentially funny naming convention that we had in the early days. For us, an item wraps one-to-many questions. They are physically different things. And for us, that's very flexible. We can do different things for the student in terms of laying out different columns, multiple questions on one single item. But at the scoring level, it's interesting as well. You can have questions at the scoring level, but you can aggregate those at the item level. I was talking to someone before. There we go. Where you might have a multi-part item, 2 questions on it, and individually you can get the raw score for that question. But at the item level, you can apply a scoring rule. Maybe you're in a state that deals with EBSR, so you can put an EBSR scoring rule on there, or maybe you're not, so you can have more of a dichotomous scoring rule. So items for us are very flexible. So we have the raw question scores, that's the underlying piece. Then we have the roll-up at the item level, and then at the session as well. So obviously we track auto-score data. Most of our question types are auto-scorable, so we track those as well. But manually scored data, we do allow you to set that as well. So you give a student maybe a constructed response, and you put it in front of a grader, and they can attach a score to that, but maybe based off a rubric. And you can store that back to the student session, so in regular reporting, you can see how the student went, even though it wasn't auto-scored. The other thing we do in terms of scoring is sub-scores. Now, this might be particular domains within a test. If I'm doing an ELA test, I want to say, well, okay, they got 70% overall, but break that down in maybe spelling or punctuation or comprehension or something like that. So you can break down that total 70% into sub-scoring pieces, depending on what the content is. So we store that as well. The next level and the final level, I suppose, is just metadata. We track how long a student spent on an item while they took the test, whether they flagged the item, maybe they were confused and they wanted to come back to it if they had time. Just the user agent in terms of the browser or the device they used. The source of the item, if it came from the item bank or the item pools. And you can also store some custom metadata in there as well. So after we've collected all this data, put it into a data warehouse, we put some reporting tools on front of it. And this is what you guys can leverage. Now, there are 2 main APIs we're looking at for reporting. The first one is the Reports API. And I suppose the key thing to remember here is that the Reports API is just a series of widgets, of little user interface components that you can put anywhere you want to create strong visualizations for your users. Could be a student, could be a teacher, district administrator, anybody. So the reports, like the rest of our APIs, are configurable. You can turn options on, turn options off. You can hide things. You can get access to the raw data if you want. And of course, they're extendable. You can do a lot of things by working with public methods or with events and extending the behavior of what our reports do out of the box.
I'm going to take the next few minutes just to give you a brief overview of some of those widget types, the user experiences that we have. For the talk today, Michael and myself spent a little time putting a couple mock-ups together. So all we've pretty much done here is grab the uncustomized instances of some of those reports and created a fairly vanilla but useful dashboard. What we've actually got here with the 3 little bubbles is 3 different widgets on the page. On the top left, we can see we've got Forrest Gump here as a student, doing okay with 64% overall for the given session. So as we're a student, we're obviously session focused in this given context. Over on the right, as Michael was talking to some of the metadata, etc., what we've actually got is a session summary that's broken out by tag. So we've broken out the tags within the content for that given session, and you're able to see those breakdown scores relative to those domains that are tagged. Finally, below that, we have a session summary. It's very simply giving us a count, in this case by question, but as Michael was alluding to, the item is also an option, so you can swap that depending on the report type you choose. So you can be item or question centric here. We can see that 1 was skipped. There's a mix of yellow and red for correct and incorrect. And you get both the count and the UI bar above it. If I were to click in on the session detail button there on the top right, I'm in pretty much a regurgitation of the assessment at this stage. So this is, here we've gone item-centric in this case. We see item 1 at the top there, but we can also go question-centric. Depending on how you choose to organize your content, you get to control what you want the student to see or what you perhaps want the teacher to see. So that's several different widgets there within the experience, but quite simple and all out of the box from Learnosity in a context like this. Finally, for some of the student-focused ones, we're actually going outside of the dashboard context now, but what we have here is multiple activities in the last score by activity. So when we're going back to the data warehouse here, we're able to see the student's performance against a given activity. They might have several attempts. So we pick the most recent session in this case, and we can get it dated, and we can see their performance in the middle column. Below that, we are also showing a breakdown, one level deeper. Michael talked about the session and the item and question level scoring. Here you've got the item level. So there might be multiple questions in each of those items, or there may not, depending on how you've chosen to organize your content. But you're able to break it out here, and you're able to see in orange, partially correct, green, correct, etc. So the different levels can be controlled, and you get to choose what's appropriate to show at that given time. Jumping across to the other user context, we have the teacher-facing reports. Here on the top, we have last score by activity. So you'll see a reasonable level of similarity here, but of course, once we've moved across to the teacher side of things, we've actually got a larger cohort. So now per row, we actually have a student. And in this case, with the top one there, it's multiple activities. So each column is a given activity, and that's something you can choose to configure. So that might be predefined set of activities that you want to show, or it might be something, depending on how you're setting it up, that's dynamically getting added based on performance of the students through the semester. Below that, we have similar, but specific to a given activity. And again, the last screen I showed in the student area, we had the item breakdown, and we're repeating that pattern here for consistency and giving the teacher the cohort level view over multiple students. And another teacher-facing area that we have is bringing in those tags again, similar to a student report we had where we were breaking down the content by tag. You can actually see we have rows with the student in the last score by tag, and each column is dynamic based on the tagging that would have been against the content. So that's going to get pulled back from our data warehouse and rendered via the reports API, all based on what was put into the content during authoring stage. Below that, similar to the item level ones we've seen twice before this, we've got a row per student, and we've actually got the breakdown there in depth with the score visible. So this is for a given activity. Taking a slightly different tack, one of the other areas that we have on the teacher-facing or proctor-facing as well reports is actually live reports. So rather than post-test completion, we actually have some controls and ability to report on your active sessions. In such context, what we actually have is bidirectional control. So we have a dashboard from within the reports API that you can instantiate, present to a teacher or proctor, depending on the context, and allow them to control the student's journey. If someone needs a toilet break, or if something goes wrong in the test hall, we're able to pause and control the time spent, etc., extending time, saving, discarding, etc., even down to handling navigation. If you actually wanted a one-on-one experience or a proctor-led context for a larger cohort, that's possible where you can send controls through for the navigation. We don't mention it here, but we also have custom events that you can wire through in this same report. We drift into a no UI experience though. So briefly here, rather than risking live demos with the little bit of internet trouble we had at the start, that was a good call. We've got a GIF here showing 3 different student sessions. So each of the 3 frames on the top right and the bottom are students independently taking an assessment. And on the top left, you have an instantiation of that proctor report, the live report. You can see as they progress through that we're getting updates on their current item state. And you can also see as we go through it that we're able to actually select a given student, or perhaps all of them if we wanted. And in this case, we're choosing the pause option to get that bidirectional control working as well.
Okay, so that's some of the out-of-the-box samples that you can do. And the key takeaways there are you can build these little widgets into visualizations that are strongest for yourselves. We found that different people always want to put different things together, so ours are just smaller widgets that you can make the whole from. Looking into extending some of the reporting though, what we have on the screen here on the left is just one of the out-of-the-box reports. It's the last score by activity. But on the right-hand side, this is just a sample of the raw data, the JSON that comes down as a part of that report. Now, it's available to your developers whenever they load the report, and you might choose to do something different with it. So in this case, we've just highlighted in white some of the properties we're interested in. And in this case, we might have loaded this report across your whole class, and we might want to show on a graph the time spent in terms of correct and incorrect and unattempted. So using the data that came down in the report, you're just building a different visualization. We don't actually have this one out of the box, but it's just an example of what you can do to easily extend and create visualizations based on the data that comes down. Another one, maybe you just want to show a big tile which is color-coded. Maybe if the student got over 80%, it's more in the green. Maybe if it's towards 50, it's yellow, unless it's red or something like that. So again, you could use the Reports API to simply load it, turn off the user interface via a configuration flag, and put your own visualization on top. Very, very simple. So this takes us now to the data API. We're talking about accessing this raw data. There's another way to access your raw data that's not directly in a browser. And this is our data API. So what this is, it's sort of a server-to-server API. There is no user interface. There's no visuals that come with it. So your developers pick this up, and they will talk to us. So the client in this case, that could be your little coder sitting down in the dungeon, and he or she interacts with the data API, which basically comes across to our database. Okay, and we construct a response payload, and that comes down as raw data for you guys to do whatever you want with. So one of the images we've seen before from clients is something like this. Now this one is constructed using the data API. We've got the points earned out of the total possible points. We've calculated a percentage, and the bottom two tables are breaking down visually by these subscores. I was talking about subscores before. So in this one, it's a detail by skill or by grade, and within there, there's accuracy and evidence and those sorts of things. So whatever the context is for you guys, the point is you can access the raw data from the data API and build any visualization you want. It could be across a class, it could be across just a single student. So you can access the raw data at any time and build whatever visualizations you want. Another example, maybe you want to display to a teacher a session status list. I just want to know who in my class has started the test, who's still in the test, and who's completed the test. Show me some dates and the status. Just something, again, that, as an example, you can use to put a visualization on top of the data you can retrieve from the data API. So moving into some of the reporting at scale. 2016 was about building out the infrastructure to allow us to do larger cohort style reporting at scale. So the first one we have, we spoke about earlier, where we collect data, put it into a data warehouse, and then we can give you some reporting on it. So what we did, as I said, in 2016, we built more of an analysis engine that we can inspect that data that we've already got and do some roll-ups, do some aggregations. And the first offering on that is what we call the aggregate report. The use case, well, policymakers, district administrators who are just analyzing larger data sets. Could be principals or teachers. They want to understand and compare class-based performances. Or really anyone who's authorized to sort of see statistical analysis across a cohort. And you define these. So our wordy slide here, well, what are these aggregate reports? You can visually summarize and explore and compare assessment results across larger cohorts of students. Today, we eliminate at 200,000 students per report. We just needed a limit, so we chose 200,000. Talk to us if you run into problems there, and we can always look at it expanding. We just had to put a ceiling on it. So you can compare the mean, the median, and other sort of statistical measures. We'll talk about a few of those in a moment. Now, the whole point of these are pre-computed. They're point in time snapshots. So maybe I want to go and look at semester 1. Semester 1 is completed. I want to compare that cohort, those scorings, and do those aggregate roll-ups for one snapshot in time. The groupings that you define, you decide that. So we don't have a report that you just turn on out of the box for this. You tell us what groupings you want. And when you define those, you can browse through that hierarchy in the browser. We're going to look at that in a moment. And at the end, it always can include student level scores. You might not want that, but you can drill down to the student level. So just an example, a district level report just makes sense to relate to. So the white sort of oval there might be an aggregate report, a single report. And what you've got within there are multiple districts. So you might have a district administrator who wants to compare their districts against other districts. Within the district, you've got schools, many schools. Within each school, you might have classes. And then, of course, within each class, you've got individual users. That's why you can go down to the raw level, to the lowest level, to the student, if you need to. Now, one of the important things to talk about with these reports is you're comparing. You're comparing at every level of the group. So at the blue level, this is our district level, you're comparing. At the red level is our class level, our school level, you're comparing at the class level. Okay? Now, this slide is just a slight variation on the theme. We're looking at different groupings. Instead of districts, schools, classes, student, we're starting at the top level at just schools. And as we drill down, maybe we want to compare gender. So we have a female group, male group. Within there, maybe we want to have a group that is around attendance. So the point is the groups are whatever you define, whatever are valuable for you. If you want to compare cohorts across the people who have attended school 90% of the time versus 80 to 90% versus 70 to 90%, if that's meaningful to you, then you could create those groups. We spoke before about, I suppose, the principle of least data. We don't store your data. And this is a little bit of a visualization on what we mean there. In this center column, the customer record, that's what you have. That's the data you have on your end. You might have a student record. There's an identifier there and a unique reference. That student, of course, has a first name, a last name, or a state, information about who they are, where they belong, where they go to school. That's on your side. If you look on the right, though, the Learnosity records, all we take is the unique reference. So that's all we take, that's all we want. You have the context, and that's how things are glued together in the browser. So having a quick look at this aggregate report, here's one we put together in the context of comparing districts. So we have 4 fictional districts here at the top level. Now we see the population, or the amount of students within each group. And the visualization here is a simple box and whisker. So we have the lowest and the highest in the range. We have the lower quartile and the upper quartile, and then the mean. So we can have that to compare the districts, and we can drill down into this district. We can see that there are a handful of high schools, or schools. Have the population report and the same box and whisker. So you're comparing now the schools within that group. As I drill into one of the schools, I'll compare the classes within that school. If I drill down into one of the classes, I see the students, their actual performance within that school to compare. Within there, of course, you could do more things. You could load a different report. If my internet is good. Okay, so we just had some customization here, where at the student level, I wanted to do something else. So there's a click event. I click a student, something happens. In this case, we opened a dialog window, and we loaded a items-based report. There were 100 items, and they got 100 correct. So the groups, we mentioned district or state, district, school, those sorts of things. We also mentioned your groupings could be based on cultural factors or socioeconomic, attendance. It could be on special needs. Maybe you have students who are dyslexic, okay, different sorts of family factors. So whatever the groupings are, they're meaningful to you. It's not a district report, that's just one sample, one type of groups that you could do. A quick look on how this is put together. So you will create and define the groupings that you want, that you need. Don't forget it's all anonymous. You'll send that to the data API and say, Learnosity, I want you to go and create these aggregate reports based on my groupings. We send that through our analysis engine, hits the database, comes back, and at the end of the day, comes through the reports API as visualizations. Now, one of the keys is this guy here, the raw data. You always have access to that. So like our other reports, you can turn off the example I was just showing you before. You can turn this report off, this user interface, and use the raw data to put any visualization you want on top of it. So they are customizable. You do have access to the raw data, always. They don't expire. Once you create a report, we get those data sets and we store them on the service and we never delete them. So you can come back a year later and they're still there. The aggregation takes some time, so it's an asynchronous process. It's not supposed to be a just-in-time report where you click a button and you immediately see the report. You think about what you want up front. Ask us to generate the report. Within an hour maybe, it's ready. And then it's always available from that point onwards. It preserves your privacy and security. Again, we don't want the personal information. We see it here, but we don't store that. We can talk to developers on how we do this, but the key is we don't want that personally identifiable information, but we still want you to be able to see it in the browser. Obviously, that's your context. So we don't store it, but it's available. We can talk to your devs about that. Now, what else could you do to extend this? Well, maybe you have a specific cohort that takes a test or a suite, a battery of tests across semester 1, semester 2, 3, and 4. What you could do is you could build a group report, an aggregate report, at the end of each semester, and you can do your comparisons at every level there. But starting from semester 2, you can now consider longitudinal reporting, where you'll say, okay, I've got how they went on that first time-based snapshot, semester 1, and then compare it with how they went in semester 2. So you're starting to look at these larger points in time, comparing these snapshots. So looking ahead with analytics, where we're going throughout the rest of the year, again, I was saying last year we spent a lot of time building out our infrastructure to be able to do these sorts of things at scale. The aggregate report is our first report that takes advantage of this. A couple of extra things that we want to be doing is, firstly, the item bank analysis. We want to give you guys a breakdown, snapshots of your banks. And this is a simple static analysis. How many question types do I have? What's sort of going deeper? Maybe I've got 50,000 multiple choice questions, but how many are multiple response versus single response? How many are true, false, those sorts of things. We also want to break down by tag. So show me how many items I have against a particular standard perhaps, or maybe depth of knowledge, how many across depth of knowledge, 1, 2, 3, those sorts of things. Just helps you manage your bank and make sure there are no sort of holes. Moving into item score analysis, we want to look at, again, time-based, more clinical item analysis, or classical item analysis rather. We want to check the item reliability and the validity. So this is where we're taking the actual scores students have done against those items, and we're applying things like the p-value and the point by serial. They're some of the earlier ones that we're doing, and we'll be doing more, no doubt, afterwards. One of the ones, this was from the keynote, we can sort of run this on demand. And again, thematically, we're trying to determine which items might have incorrect or bad validation, or they've been assigned to maybe in the wrong students, the wrong part of a test perhaps, on the hard side or the easy side. So these sorts of things we can do on demand, and again, we're setting these up to be available out of the box. Some different visualizations on what we can do with the aggregate reports here. We're looking at bringing in tagging to the aggregate reports, which we don't have today. So now we can break down maybe by standard within a larger cohort of item scores. So that's what we're doing. We're really focusing on the analysis engine point from the rest of the year. We're looking at the data we've already captured. What can we do with that data to make it more valuable to you and the reporting API, whether you want to use our visuals or you want to access the raw data yourselves to create something else on top.